You know, every single day, you and I interact with this massive, invisible system. It's what sets the price of your coffee, the cost of your morning toast, really the availability of all our food. It's the global agricultural complex, and it might seem totally chaotic, but believe it or not, it actually runs on a pretty clear set of rules. So let's dive in and crack that code.
So to get started, let's just ask a simple question that gets right to the heart of this whole thing. Why on earth does a lack of rain thousands of miles away in Brazil directly impact the price you pay for chicken at your local grocery store? I mean, it seems completely random, right? But as we're about to see, it's anything but.
Well, the answer is that these things are linked. They're all part of a huge interconnected network that we call the ag complex. And just like any complex system, it has its own logic, its own language. So, our job today? Let's learn the rules of the game.
All right, first things first, we've got to see this system for what it really is. And it's so much more than just farming. This isn't just a random collection of different crops, corn over here, wheat over there. The reality is, it's all one single integrated system.
So what is the ag complex exactly?
Well, think of it as this massive global web of markets. It includes the big ones, like grains, but also oilseeds like soybeans, softs like coffee and sugar, and even livestock. But here's the absolute key. They all act as one single coherent system. A nudge in one corner sends ripples through the entire thing.
Okay, so what's the first most fundamental rule of this whole game? It's actually really simple. In the world of agriculture, biology is the boss, period. You can't just flip a switch in a factory and decide to make more corn. Nature runs on a very, very strict timetable. And this really shows you the core difference, right? On the one hand, you've got industrial production. A factory can just ramp things up if demand is high. But on the other hand, you have agriculture, which is locked into this fixed biological calendar. A farmer plants in the spring, they harvest in the fall. That's it. These biological lags mean supply just can't respond quickly to problems, and that is a huge reason why we see so much price volatility.
And within that fixed calendar, the biggest wild card of all is the weather. I mean, everything from temperature and rain to how much sun you get, it all directly impacts how much food is grown. This creates these predictable seasons of risk in major growing areas, like the US Midwest or Brazil. And then you have these big global patterns, like El Niño, that can just come in and throw a massive curveball at the entire system.
All right, that brings us to rule number 2, and this one is all about the physical reality of these things. Unlike a stock or a bond, a ton of corn is, well, it's a ton of corn. You have to actually put it somewhere. And let me tell you, that storage is not free, not even close.
And this leads us to a really key concept called the cost of carry. It's basically everything that goes into just holding on to a physical product over time. You've got to pay for the warehouse, you need insurance in case something goes wrong, there are financing costs, and of course, there's always the risk that some of it will just spoil or shrink. It all adds up. And you can actually see this cost of carry reflected in what we could call the market's mood. When supply is abundant and there's tons of grain sitting around, prices for delivering the future are higher. Why? Because you have to pay to store it all. That's called contango. But when supply gets scarce, the whole market flips. The price for delivery right now is higher than in the future. That's called backwardation, and it's a giant red flag. It's the market screaming, "I need it now." So how do we actually measure this scarcity? Well, analysts use one number more than pretty much any other, the stocks-to-use ratio. It sounds complicated, but it's incredibly simple and powerful. It just tells you how much inventory we have left compared to how much we're using. You can think of it as the market's fuel gauge. And on that fuel gauge, some numbers are way more important than others. When the stocks-to-use ratio for a big commodity like corn or soybeans drops down to a critical level, let's say around 10%, the entire system goes on high alert. The red lights are flashing. At that point, there's basically zero room for error, and even a tiny disruption could send prices through the roof. This leads us right into rule number 3, which is where that interconnectedness we talked about really shines. In the ag complex, nothing exists in a vacuum. Absolutely everything is constantly competing with or being turned into something else.
A perfect example is the humble soybean. A farmer harvests the bean, sure, but that's just the start of its journey. It then goes to a processor where it gets crushed. And that splits it into 2 totally separate products. You get soybean meal, which is a major protein source for animal feed, and soybean oil, which is used in everything from salad dressing to biofuel. See? One bean, multiple markets.
So what's driving this whole process of turning one thing into 2 other things? It's simple: profit.
There's a term for it, the crush margin. It's just the value of the meal and oil minus the cost of the raw soybean. If that margin gets wide, processors have a huge incentive to buy and crush as many beans as they can get their hands on, and that sends a powerful signal all the way back down the supply chain to the farmer.
And this whole dynamic creates these incredibly powerful substitution effects. Let's say a drought drives the price of corn way up. Now, corn is normally a go-to for animal feed, but if it gets too expensive, livestock producers start looking for an alternative. All of a sudden, a lower-grade wheat, which is usually for human food, starts to look like a pretty good deal for feed. And just like that, a shock in the corn market has rippled directly into the wheat market.
Okay, on to our fourth and final rule. We've covered nature, we've covered economics, but we cannot forget the human element. Governments, policy, politics, these are massive and often totally unpredictable wildcards in this game. A government, just with the stroke of a pen, can completely rewrite the rules of the market. They can ban exports to keep food at home, they can limit imports with quotas, they can create demand out of thin air with biofuel mandates, or they can release strategic reserves to lower prices. Any of these actions can instantly override all the other factors we've talked about.
And on top of all that, pretty much all global agriculture is priced in US dollars. This makes the local currency exchange rate a massive variable. For example, if the Brazilian real gets weaker against the dollar, Brazilian soybeans suddenly become way cheaper for buyers in China or Europe. That puts immediate pressure on American farmers to compete. It's this constant financial tug-of-war.
So there we have it, our 4 key rules. Biology is boss, scarcity and storage matter, everything is a substitute, and politics is a wild card. Now, how do we put all this together into a practical blueprint so you can actually make sense of what's going on?
Well, it gives us this really powerful 5-step framework. You always start with a balance sheet. How tight are the inventories? Then you overlay the weather. After that, you have to factor in those human wildcards, policy and currency. Then you look at the market's own signals, the curves and spreads. And finally, you zoom out and integrate the bigger macro picture.
And the real beauty of this framework is that it's universal. As the source material puts it, the specifics of each commodity will vary, but the underlying logic remains consistent. Whether you're looking at cocoa, wheat, or palm oil, this same logic always applies.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Why does a drought in Brazil make your chicken more expensive? Well, the drought tightens the global soybean supply. That's rule number 1, biology. That raises the price of soybean meal, which is key for animal feed. That's rule number 3, substitution. And higher feed costs for farmers ultimately mean a higher price for chicken at the store. See? It's all connected. So now we've decoded the basic rules of the ACT complex. We get how the game is played. But I'll leave you with a final thought. This entire system we've built, it's based on a climate that's been relatively stable for a long time. Now that you know the rules, what happens when climate change starts rewriting rule number 1?